Picture the untamed wilderness of the American West. Vast, rugged, and ruled by giants. One bear in particular would become the stuff of legend. Old Ephraim, the grizzly that evaded hunters for over a decade, dismantling traps and striking fear into the heart of Cache Valley, Utah. But was he truly the monstrous beast of folklore, or something more? Join us as we unravel the myth and mystery of the West's most notorious outlaw bear, here on Mythic Wilds. It's the late 1800s in northeastern Utah. The settlers of Cache Valley are bustling with preparations as the cattle and sheep season begins, driving their herds up to graze on the lush grasses of the Bear River Range. What was once a tranquil, wild landscape teeming with diverse wildlife is now transforming under the weight of expansion. In just 30 years, from 1870 to 1900, the number of livestock in Cache County surged from a modest 3,000 to a staggering 86,000 head. This rapid growth wasn't without consequence. The settlers unknowingly or uncaringly left a trail of destruction in their wake. Sheep in particular were the culprits of environmental ruin. Their relentless grazing laid waste to native grasses and shrubs, stripping the land of its natural defenses and rendering it barren. Even the once pure water sources were poisoned by their waste, further eroding the delicate balance of the local ecosystem. For the region's apex predator, the grizzly bear, this new reality was absolutely devastating. Grizzlies, omnivorous by nature, relied heavily on the rich vegetation and the wild game that once thrived here. But as the landscape withered, their options grew scarce. Driven by hunger, the bears turned to the only remaining source of nourishment: livestock. What had once been a rare encounter between bear and settler now became a deadly conflict as hungry grizzlies raided the flocks, lured by the promise of easy meals. This sudden and sustained assault on their livelihood infuriated the settlers, and they responded with force. A small group of grizzlies, emboldened by success, continued their attacks, learning quickly that the sheep and cattle provided not just sustenance, but also survival. In desperation, sheep herders enlisted trappers to kill bears without discrimination, leading to a fierce war between man and beast. The grizzly, once king of the wilderness, was now hunted relentlessly. It wasn't until 1903 that the government attempted to step in, declaring portions of Cache County a protected national forest by 1908. But even these environmental protections weren't enough to stop the tide of extinction. Between the arrival of settlers in 1847 in the Salt Lake Valley and the early 1920s, grizzly bears were pushed to the brink. Their original range, stretching from central Mexico to north Midwestern United States, shrank dramatically. At their peak, over 50,000 grizzlies roamed the lower 48 states. But by the time the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1975, fewer than 1,000 remained. Grizzlies vanished from state after state, hunted down by bounty hunters, ranchers, and trappers. California's last known grizzly was killed in 1924, Arizona's in 1936. The once mighty bear had been driven to the edge of oblivion, and Utah was no different. By the 1920s, only a handful of grizzly bears still wandered the wilds of Utah. Yet among these last survivors, one bear would go on to become a legend. Embodying the spirit of the wild that settlers sought to tame, his name was Old Ephraim, and his story would live on far beyond the grave. His cunning ways earned him a fearsome reputation in the Bear River Range, where he became a ghostly figure, avoiding capture and dismantling traps with uncanny precision. Physically, Old Ephraim was said to be a colossal bear, towering nearly 10 feet tall when standing on his hind legs, and weighing more than 1,000 pounds. Such size isn't impossible for a grizzly, and while the measurements might have grown in the retelling, they reflect the awe he inspired in those who encountered his tracks or his destruction. Grizzlies are known for their intelligence, able to hide their tracks, ambush prey, and even cover themselves in dense trees or rocks. Old Ephraim's ability to evade capture was a testament to his craftiness which only added to the mystique surrounding him. The origin of his name, Old Ephraim, remains a point of debate. Some say the name came from a tale spun by P.T. Barnum, the legendary circus promoter, while others believe it was drawn from the biblical figure Ephraim, symbolizing strength and power. Another theory ties it to Theodore Roosevelt, who named a bear Old Ephraim in his book, Hunting Trips of a Ranchman. Regardless of its source, the name stuck, becoming synonymous with the elusive bear who roamed the wilderness, striking fear and fascination in equal measure. One distinctive trait set Old Ephraim apart from other bears in the region. He only had 3 toes on one of his feet. This unusual feature made tracking him easier for those who sought to capture or kill him, and it earned him another nickname, Old Three Toes. Yet even the origin of his missing toe is shrouded in mystery. Some claim that it was torn off by a trap during one of his many near captures, while others say that it was the result of a birth defect. The truth, much like the bear itself, remains elusive. Old Ephraim's range was vast, spanning from the northern reaches of Soda Springs, Idaho, to the southern valleys of Weber, Utah. However, as he aged, he seemed to settle into Logan Canyon, about 20 miles east of Logan, Utah. It was here among the thick forests and rocky terrain that Old Ephraim made his final stand. But before his reign came to an end, his legend only grew. Stories from the time spoke of his immense strength. Some claimed he could bite through a 6-inch aspen log with a single snap of his jaws, while others swore the bear knew how to dismantle traps without setting them off at all, a feat that baffled even the most experienced hunters. Though he was rarely seen, his presence was undeniable. Dead sheep scattered across the valley were often the first sign that Old Ephraim had passed through, his hunger insatiable, and with each kill, his boldness grew stronger. In one particular infamous incident, Old Ephraim reportedly killed 50 sheep in a single night, an act what is known as surplus killing, a behavior in which a predator kills more prey than it can consume at once. This behavior, while seemingly wasteful, is common among predators like bears, wolves, and even foxes, who sometimes store excess food for later on, or in some cases abandon it altogether. In Alaska, brown bears are known to engage in surplus killing during salmon runs, often leaving behind uneaten fish. For Old Ephraim, the motivation behind these killings may have been to stockpile resources, or simply because his instinct to hunt had become untethered from the natural limits of his environment. To the settlers of Cache Valley, however, these actions were not simply the work of a hungry bear. They were an existential threat to their way of life. Their livelihoods depended on their flocks, and with each raid their herds dwindled. Old Ephraim had become more than a nuisance. He was an enemy that needed to be eliminated at all costs. It was at this point that Frank Clark entered the story, a man as persistent and determined as the bear he sought. The stage was set for a showdown between man and beast, one that would leave its mark not only on the history of the valley, but on the lore of the American West itself. Frank Clark, a seasoned sheep herder from Cherry Creek, Idaho, was no stranger to the rugged wilderness of the Cache Valley. Every summer, he drove his flock south to graze in the valley's rich pastures. While Clark held a deep respect for nature, his loyalty to his sheep outweighed any fondness he had for the wild. He was fiercely protective of his herd, willing to kill any predator that dared to threaten them. And as Old Ephraim's deadly rampage escalated, Clark's mission became clear. He would stop the bear that had cost him so dearly. In his own words, Clark swore an eternal vengeance on bears, and especially Old Ephraim. Over the course of 34 years, it's estimated that Clark killed 43 bears while defending his flock. But none consumed him quite like Old Ephraim. Much of what we know today about Old Ephraim comes directly from Clark himself. By the time the Great Bear appeared on his radar, Clark had already been battling the predators of the valley for years. But Old Ephraim was different, smarter, stronger, and more elusive. The chase began around 1910, and for the next decade, Clark set traps and waited, hoping for a glimpse of the bear that seemed to haunt his every move, his every step. Old Ephraim was a ghost in the wilderness, dismantling traps with ease, always one step ahead. Most nights, Clark didn't even see the bear. He would arrive at his traps only to find them sprung or discarded, as if Old Ephraim was mocking his efforts. After 10 long years of frustration, Clark had learned the bear's habits. He knew where Ephraim liked to rest during the heat of the day, and with renewed determination, he set one final trap. This time, he was sure it would work. Clark carefully selected the site, baited the trap, and set up camp nearby, his hopes hanging on this venture, being different from the many failed attempts before. That night, Clark was awakened by a loud noise outside of his tent. Instinctively, he reached for his rifle and crept into the darkness to investigate. What he saw next would stay with him for the rest of his life. In Clark's own words, "Ephraim raised up on his hind legs with his back to me, and a 14-foot log chain wound around his arm as carefully as a man would have done it, and a 23-pound bear trap on his foot. Standing 9 feet 11 inches high, he could have gone that way and have gotten away. But he turned around and I saw the most magnificent sight any man could ever see." For a moment, Clark was frozen with awe and fear. There stood old Ephraim, an unstoppable force of nature, lifting the heavy trap above his head as though it were nothing. The bear had a chance to flee, but instead he turned to face Clark. As Ephraim closed the distance, still upright on his hind legs, Clark's paralysis turned to panic. "I was paralyzed with fear, and I couldn't raise my gun," Clark recalled. The bear loomed over him, and Clark could only wait as Ephraim advanced, the trap still in hand. Clark snapped back to reality when Ephraim was within 6 feet of him. Desperate, he thrust his rifle forward and fired. The shot hit its mark, but old Ephraim barely flinched. Pushed back for a mere moment, the bear charged again, undeterred. Clark fired 6 more rounds, each bullet striking the massive grizzly. But Ephraim refused to fall. The bear continued to stagger toward Clark, blood pouring from his mouth. Still intent on reaching his foe, Clark fled, with Ephraim lumbering behind him, bloodied but relentless, all while Clark's dogs nipped at the bear's heels in a desperate attempt to slow him down. It was only as the bear closed in once more that Clark took his final shot. With his last bullet, Clark aimed for the head. The round struck true, piercing old Ephraim's brain, and with that, the great bear finally collapsed. "I think I felt sorry I had to do it," Clark later admitted, his words revealing a flicker of remorse for ending the life of the animal that had eluded him for so long. After old Ephraim's death, Clark and a fellow herder set about the grim task of skinning the bear and burying him near the site of their confrontation. The place became known as Ephraim's grave, a quiet reminder of the last grizzly bear to roam those mountains. And so the king of the mountain had fallen, bringing to an end not only the life of a legendary predator, but also signaling the end of an American West. With old Ephraim's death, the wilderness itself seemed to shrink, and the balance between man and nature was forever altered. The apex predators that once ruled the land were now little more than a memory, hunted to near extinction, their reign brought down by settlers like Clark, determined to carve out their place in the wild. A few years after old Ephraim's death, his story continued to captivate the imagination of locals and beyond. In an unusual turn of events, Boy Scout Troop number 43 from Logan, Utah, exhumed the legendary bear's skull, sending it to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where it remained on display for several decades. In 1978, the Smithsonian returned the skull to Utah, where it now resides at Utah State University's library, preserving a tangible piece of the bear's legacy. Old Ephraim's story grew into a prominent piece of the American West folklore, symbolizing the tense relationship between man and nature. Although Frank Clark had once described old Ephraim as a bear who only killed what he needed to survive, local lore painted a much darker picture. To many, old Ephraim was seen as a menace to livestock and people alike, earning him a reputation as an outlaw animal. This image of the bear as a relentless threat to human settlements became part of the myth that surrounded his life. In 1966, old Ephraim's story was immortalized with a stone monument erected at his gravesite in Logan, Utah. Standing 11 feet tall, the monument reflects the height attributed to the bear in local legends, a towering reminder of his once dominant presence in the region. The monument also features a poignant poem by Nephi J. Bott, which reads, Old Ephraim, your deeds were so wrong, yet we build you this marker and sing you this song. To the king of the forest, so mighty and tall, we salute you, old Ephraim, the king of them all. Today, visitors to Logan Canyon can follow a 5.5-mile hike to old Ephraim's grave, a popular destination for those seeking to connect with the history and wilderness of the region. The hike and monument serve not only as reminders to the bear, but also as a reminder of the wild, untamed lands that once defined the American West. Old Ephraim's legacy endures, woven into the fabric of Cache Valley's history, his story passed down through generations. He remains a symbol of power, of the region's former wilderness, his life and death emblematic of the broader struggles between wildlife and human settlement. Today, Old Ephraim is not just remembered as a fearsome predator, but also as a piece of living history, a landmark in the destruction of the Wild West. When it comes to the legend of Old Ephraim, separating fact from fiction can be a challenge. Over the years, the bear's story has taken on a life of its own, with each retelling adding new layers of myth and embellishment. For starters, the name Old Ephraim wasn't unique to the famous Cache Valley grizzly. As noted earlier, this name was commonly used to describe large bears throughout the American West, often becoming shorthand for any particularly impressive or elusive grizzly. The most glaring piece of fiction surrounding Old Ephraim is his reported size. Stories from the time claim he stood nearly 10 feet tall and weighed 1,000 pounds, a towering giant by any measure. However, modern scientific analysis of Old Ephraim's skull suggests a more modest yet still formidable nature. Experts estimate that the bear was closer to 7.5 feet tall and weighed around 550 pounds. While this still made him an impressive specimen larger than many of his kind, it falls short of the enormous dimensions ascribed to him in local legend. Another misconception is that Old Ephraim was the last living grizzly bear in Utah. While it's true that by the time of his death in 1923, grizzlies were on the verge of extinction in the state, Old Ephraim wasn't the very last of his kind. According to the U.S. Forest Service, there were still about 10 grizzlies left in the Cache Valley area in 1925. These remaining bears disappeared over the next few years, with the Forest Service reporting that by 1930, the grizzly population in Utah had been wiped out. Interestingly, Frank Clark himself claimed to have seen evidence of grizzlies in the region as late as the early 1940s, suggesting the possibility that a few survived longer than official records indicate. Despite the blending of fact and fiction, one thing is certain. Old Ephraim left a lasting mark on the Cache Valley and its people. His size, strength, and cunning made him a formidable opponent for those who hunted him, while his ability to evade capture for so long only added to his mystique. Though some details may have been exaggerated, his impact during his lifetime and the legacy that continues to this day remains undeniable. Old Ephraim's story serves as a powerful reminder of the complicated relationship between humans and the natural world. Even as the lines between myth and reality blur, his tale endures, symbolizing the wilderness that once stretched across the American West and the wild creatures that inhabited it. The story of the grizzly bear in the American West is one of survival, resilience, and recovery. After decades of being pushed to the brink of extinction, the grizzly bear has made an impressive comeback. Listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act in 1975, grizzlies were given federal protections that allowed their populations to begin to rebound. Fast forward to June 2017, and the listing was officially revoked, marking a significant milestone in the species' recovery. In the year 2000, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service took another bold step by announcing plans to reintroduce 25 grizzly bears into the wilds of Montana and Idaho, helping to restore their presence in key parts of their historic range. Today, in 2024, efforts continue as the state of Washington has committed to reintroducing a population of 25 grizzly bears over the next 5 to 10 years. Despite some resistance from communities concerned about living alongside apex predators, the reintroduction of grizzlies is crucial for maintaining a healthy ecosystem. Grizzly bears play a vital role in the environment by dispersing native plant seeds, controlling prey populations, and promoting overall biodiversity. In their absence, ecosystems can fall out of balance, negatively impacting other species and the landscape itself. Grizzlies are more than just symbols of the wild. They are essential players in the intricate web of life that defines the American West. When the bears thrive, the entire ecosystem flourishes. Their recovery is not just a victory for wildlife conservation, it's a reminder that humans and nature can coexist together. and that protecting apex predators like the grizzly ultimately benefits everybody. The West needs them, and as we restore their populations, we also restore the balance that once defined this vast wilderness. As we close this chapter on the legend of Old Ephraim, we're reminded of the powerful connection between myth and nature, and how these stories echo through time, from the fierce wilderness of the past to the slow resurgence of grizzlies today. The Wild West remains a place where legends are born and ecosystems thrive. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history and folklore. If you enjoyed this episode of Mythic Wilds, be sure to subscribe for more tales of legendary creatures, untamed lands, and the mysteries that still roam among us. Until next time, stay curious, stay wild.